All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Facebook Live, coming to you live from my living room. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our today's Facebook Live, coming to you live from my living room. Today's topic is going to be all about neurological health and sugar. So, all through this week, we've been talking about how sugar impacts our metabolic health on Monday, and on Wednesday/Thursday, our cardiovascular health. And today, we're going to be talking about the brain, your brain health, and specifically how sugar impacts it. For everyone watching, feel free to give a little wave or a shout out in the comments section, and I'll be sure to address everyone. But let's dive straight into it. So, the brain, it's a pretty important organ in our body, and it's also the one controlling things like our hunger, our satiety, addiction, our mindfulness, attention, and awareness, how we're thinking, and how we're thinking about what we're eating as well. It's not often thought about as a very metabolically active organ, or the fact that it uses a lot of fuel, but it actually does use a lot of fuel and requires a lot of energy to power it and keep it functioning at a high capacity each day. And it's also been long thought that glucose is the only fuel source that the brain can use. It certainly can't use fats or proteins to power it, and that's because they can't cross the blood-brain barrier. But there's also another substance that's produced in the body called ketones, and we know that they can power the brain and provide a fuel source for brain function as well. Ketones are produced when your body oxidizes fat as its fuel source. So the brain uses glucose for energy in most healthy populations, but it can also use these ketones or ketone bodies as well in the absence of glucose. And this only occurs when the body is in a state of what we call ketosis. So when you don't eat carbohydrates, you use fat, whether stored or ingested, as your fuel source. But we know that eating lots of sugar and carbohydrates over a long period of time, the tissues around the body, think liver, muscles, pancreas, kidneys, all become insulin resistant. And this is something that we've touched on many times throughout this week. And the brain, it turns out, may be no different. Then, if our brain tissue is insulin resistant and glucose metabolism in the brain is worse, but glucose is the only fuel source that we have because we're eating lots of sugar and carbohydrates and we're not in ketosis, how can we expect the brain to be properly fueled and function at its optimum? It's likely that our cognition, our focus, strength, memory, and overall health are all going to be impacted negatively by this. So have a think for a moment about what diseases or disease states may be associated with what I've just mentioned. I'll give you a minute. So what I'm going to be talking about next is dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Conditions that many people might have thought have absolutely no link to what we're eating or in particular to sugar. But there's been more of a research focus on this lately, and it turns out that it does have a pretty big role to play. More so on the prevention side as opposed to a cure, as there's no known cure yet for either dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Both of these conditions, your risk of getting them increases as you age. If you have type 2 diabetes, you have a 2 to 3 times higher risk of developing either dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And again, your risk is increased if you have a lot of visceral adiposity or weight around your midsection, your belly. So we know also that eating a low carbohydrate diet and fasting can reverse type 2 diabetes and therefore reduce your dementia risk. So how can eating less sugar, less carbohydrates impact our risk for these neurological conditions? Well, to answer that question, I'll have to break down in a little bit more detail what causes these conditions. So Alzheimer's disease, it occurs when a buildup of a protein called beta amyloid occurs in the brain and clump together in the brain. Those keen learners out there might remember that Daniel and I have mentioned beta amyloid proteins in the past on our sleep videos. And that's because good deep sleep can actually reduce their buildup in the brain. And it's the clumping together of these beta amyloid proteins that are toxic to the brain, essentially. And one thing that sugar does is it can help to bind or clump these beta amyloid proteins together in the brain. And when further combined with other processed foods and processed seed oils as well, it creates a massive insult and damage to our brain tissue. We also know that fructose, which is a kind of sugar, causes more what's called glycation stress than glucose alone. And this causes advanced glycation end products, which further contribute to that clumping of beta amyloid protein, which becomes toxic in the brain. And that's when we start to see some changes in things like cognition, memory, all the hallmark signs of Alzheimer's and dementia. Now, there are obviously many factors that are impacting people's risk and people getting Alzheimer's and dementia. And to be fair, it's beyond the scope of this little video. Things like genetics, particular genes, including the ApoE4 gene, increase your risk. Not getting much sleep will increase your risk as well. But we can now also start to see how sugar, and in particular having too much glucose and fructose in your diet, plus high levels of insulin, which we know as a result of these two, can damage the brain tissue and increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. There is a reason why Alzheimer's disease has recently been informally termed type 3 diabetes. And that's because it's essentially a stage of insulin-resistant brain tissue and brain cells. Much like in type 2 diabetes, you have insulin resistance of liver and muscle tissue, to name a few. So what are some things that you can do to reduce your risk of these conditions? I'm sure everyone wants to know because feeling like you're losing your memory or your mind is obviously not something anyone ever wants to go through, and anyone with family members that have been through this will know how difficult it is on everyone around. So things like getting a good night's sleep, as we've touched on in previous videos, is essential. Exercise, in particular aerobic exercise, is fantastic for your brain health. And when it comes to the diet and what you're eating and what you're fueling your body with, avoiding seed oils such as trans fats and avoiding sugar and processed carbohydrates is essential. Eating real food is the best way to go for your brain when it comes to your diet. Last thing I wanted to talk about for today is mental health. Obviously, a condition that has a lot to do with the brain and a broad range of conditions, I guess you could say. There's many factors at play here. But what I've spoken about, not only today, but all through the last 2 weeks in regards to sugar and insulin resistance applies here too, as they're and undoubtedly affecting the brain, and mental health conditions are undoubtedly related to the brain. If you're not able to think straight, apply reason, and reduce neurotrophins and hormones that lead to stress, how can we possibly hope to have optimal mental health and clarity of function? So can eating too much sugar make our brains function worse and therefore affect our mental health? Well, a lot of research is being done in this space now, and I think it looks like the answer is going to be yes, absolutely it can. So to summarize everything for today, we know that overeating sugar and carbohydrates causes elevated insulin and insulin-resistant tissues, not only around the body and the muscle and the liver, but also in the brain as well. And this can lead to things like impaired cognition, impaired memory, focus and attention, all of which are hallmark signs of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, also known as type 3 diabetes. By reducing your sugar and carbohydrate intake to a very little amount of your diet, this will help to reduce insulin levels and allow oxidation of fats, so burning fats for energy, and the production of ketones, which we know that the brain can use as a fuel source as opposed to glucose. I know that brain health is extremely important. It's the most important organ in our body and arguably the most amazing thing on planet Earth. So keeping it functioning at its optimum should be your number one priority. I know it is my number one priority. Um, if you know anyone who would benefit from these videos or any of the information that we've gone through for today, please invite them to like the page and share and get as much out of these videos as possible. Next week, we're going to be talking about a little bit less doom and gloom, a little bit less disease, and more some practical ways that you can reduce sugar from your diet or lose weight or make healthier decisions when it comes to your food. We've got a lot of exciting and different presentations and videos in store. So I hope everyone is around to join us next week. But until then, have a great week.